February 12th, 1943. Truck Lagoon, Caroline Islands. Warm rain hisses on steel decks and turns the air into a wet engine room. Inside the flagship Yamato, the corridor smells of ink, cigarette smoke, and salt that has dried into every seam of paint. A petty officer slides a paper door aside and bows low, careful not to scrape the wooden frame. Behind him, in the map room, lamplight pools over the Pacific like a fever dream. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands with his hands clasped behind his back, shoulders square, face unreadable. He is not tall, but the silence around him gives him weight. The officers nearby avoid breathing too loudly. On the wall, a chart is pinned with colored strings and tiny flags, red for garrisons, black for lost ships, blue pencil marks for airfields that exist now only as rumors and craters. The perimeter, the great arc Japan carved in the first months of the war, curves across the paper like a defensive spell. A staff officer clears his throat and reads the latest dispatch from the south. Guadalcanal is finished. The evacuation, the last desperate lift of men from beaches under American air attack, has succeeded. But the word success tastes like ashes. Thousands are saved. Yes, yet the island remains in enemy hands, and the perimeter line on the map no longer feels like a wall. It feels like a wound. Yamamoto's chief of staff, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, watches the admiral's eyes. Ugaki has written down everything for years, the numbers, the moods, the tone of voices. He understands what the map is doing to them. In the first rush of victory, the map had been proof of genius. Now it is a trap. A line drawn too far from home becomes a line that must be defended everywhere, all at once, by ships and aircraft Japan cannot replace. Outside, you can hear truck itself working like a living machine. Tugs cough and pull at anchor chains. Fuel hoses snake across decks. In the harbor, cruisers sit low with supplies, their hulls streaked with rust and tropical grime. A flight of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers drones overhead, thin and fast, as if speed alone could keep them safe. Yamamoto watches them through the open hatch for a moment, then returns to the chart. He remembers the beginning, and in the room it is as if everyone remembers with him. December 1941 had broken like a wave. In the darkness before dawn, carrier aircraft had risen from 6 decks and flown toward Pearl Harbor. In Malaya and the Philippines, soldiers moved with bayonets fixed, supported by bombers that seemed to arrive from nowhere. The Imperial Navy had struck at the enemy's battleships, but the deeper intent had always been this sees a ring of bases so wide, so sharp, that the United States would bleed itself white trying to cut back through it. The defensive perimeter was not a single wall. It was a chain of airfields, harbors, and submarine pickets spread across an ocean so vast it could swallow fleets. Wake, Rabaul, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Solomons, the Dutch East Indies. Each captured point was supposed to be a thorn, each lagoon a place to refuel and repair, each runway a place for Zeros to rise and slash at American bombers. Japanese admirals spoke of it as a problem of geometry and will. Stretch the line far enough, make every American advance costly, then force Washington into negotiations before Japan's industry and oil ran dry. For a time it seemed plausible. The enemy's response was slow, distant, confused. Japanese pilots, many of them veterans of China, fought like men who had trained their whole lives for the moment. Cruisers and destroyers ran night seas with confidence, their long lance torpedoes sleeping in tubes like knives in sheaths. In briefing rooms, officers pointed at islands and spoke as if the ocean itself belonged to them. But Yamamoto had never been comfortable with the dream. He had studied America. He had seen shipyards and assembly lines. He knew the enemy would not stay confused forever. And now, In February 1943, the proof lies in the black flags on the map. Midway is there, a small mark on the paper that carries the weight of a catastrophe. 4 fleet carriers gone in a single day, their decks blazing, their aircraft sliding into the sea. The best trained aviators, the ones who could land by instinct on a pitching deck, gone with them. After Midway, Japan's perimeter did not break immediately, but it began to soften, like metal heated until it no longer holds shape. Guadalcanal had finished what Midway started. It turned the perimeter into a battlefield that never slept. It forced destroyers to burn fuel at night just to deliver rice and ammunition. It dragged cruisers into close range where American radar could find them in the dark. It bled pilots faster than training schools could produce them. Every week brought another list of sunk transports, another air group reduced to a handful of survivors. Ugaki leans closer to the chart and traces the Solomon Islands with a finger, stopping at the point where the line should have held. He does not say the thought aloud, but it hangs in the room like humidity. If the Americans can take one link, they can take the next. If they can choose the place and the time, then Japan is no longer controlling the Pacific. Japan is reacting to it. Yamamoto finally speaks, quiet enough that everyone must lean in to catch it. The perimeter is collapsing faster than they can rebuild it. The enemy is learning. And the sea, indifferent, waits to see which nation can keep feeding ships and men into its hunger. Ugaki steps to the side table where a stack of casualty lists and after-action reports sits like a second chart, one made of paper instead of ocean. He flips a page, and the sound is sharp in the lamplight. Around him, senior officers in dark uniforms keep their hands folded, as if any movement might knock something loose. They are thinking of Midway again, because Midway never really ended. It simply moved into their bloodstream. June 5th. 1942 is still there in their minds like the smell of fuel that will not wash out. 4 carriers burning. Akagi and Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu. Men jumping into water slicked with oil. Flight deck crews trying to shove bombs over the side while fire climbs into the hangars. The ships can be replaced in theory. On some future day, but the carrier air groups, those pilots trained to land on a moving deck after hours over empty sea, those cannot be conjured back. Japan's naval aviation had been built like a sword, folded and refined over years. At Midway, the blade was cracked. Yamamoto knows it, and so do the men watching him. In the early war, Japanese admirals believed the decisive battle doctrine, the Kantai Kessen, would work because quality would overcome quantity. A smaller, better trained force would strike first, strike harder, and force the enemy to hesitate. But now the enemy is not hesitating. The enemy is learning how to fight at sea with machines and industrial rhythm. Ugaki turns toward the chart again and taps a point on the ocean between Hawaii and Japan. Midway is a tiny dot on a vast sheet, yet it dictates everything. That battle did not only destroy ships, it pulled the initiative away. With the carriers gone, Japan cannot cover the perimeter with the same reach. There is no longer a reliable umbrella of flight decks that can appear where needed. Instead, they must lean on land-based air, and land-based air needs land. That means islands. That means airfields. That means supply routes, fuel dumps, anti-aircraft guns, construction battalions, and constant shipping. And shipping is what the Americans are taking away. A junior staff officer enters with another message tube, dripping rainwater onto the deck plates. He bows, hands the dispatch up the chain, and backs out without turning his back on the room. The message is from Rabaul, the fortress at the far end of the Solomon chain. Aircraft losses, fuel shortages, runways cratered again. The pilots are tired, and the new ones arrive with fewer hours. Less instinct, more fear. In the center of the room, Yamamoto's expression does not change, but his fingers tighten behind his back. He is thinking of Guadalcanal, the island that forced Japan into a fight of attrition, the kind of fight they promised themselves they would never accept. It began as a simple problem, an American airfield under construction that had to be erased. It became a grinding contest of night runs, bombardments, and air raids that demanded constant sacrifice from destroyers and cruisers. The Tokyo Express runs became famous, but fame does not feed boilers. Each trip burned precious fuel. Each trip risked American aircraft by day and radar-guided guns by night. Each trip produced one more damaged hull, limping back to truck. And then there is Radar, one of the officers, a captain with a crisp mustache and bloodshot eyes, mentions it quietly, as if speaking the word might summon it. Radar has turned darkness into a weapon. In the old doctrine, Japanese night fighting skill was unmatched. Lookouts with sharp eyes, commanders who could read the sea by the tilt of a horizon, torpedo officers who could launch by feel. But now, American ships can see what human eyes cannot. They can track movement in rain squalls, in smoke. Beyond the curve of moonlight, the sea is becoming transparent, and Japan's advantage in the night is leaking away. You can almost feel the dread under the formal language. If the Americans can find you in the dark, then your destroyers are not just couriers, they are targets. If your cruisers are targets, then the perimeter cannot be supplied. If the perimeter cannot be supplied, then it cannot be held. Yamamoto walks to the far side of the map and studies the string of islands like a man measuring the length of a rope around his own throat. The defensive arc they seized from December 1941 through mid-1942 was meant to buy time. Time for negotiations, time for fortification, time for the enemy to tire. But time is not behaving. The Americans are not negotiating. They are building, they are training. They are sending new ships across the horizon like replacements in a factory line. Japanese admirals feel it even if they do not say it. Every loss on their side is a permanent subtraction. Every loss on the American side is a delay. Ugaki writes a note, the pencil scratching across paper. He does not write fear, because fear would be unprofessional. He writes concern, strain, tempo, pilot shortage. But the meaning is the same. Yamamoto turns from the chart and looks at his staff, his voice steady. The perimeter is not just a line of islands. It is a promise. If it fails, the war becomes a retreat across the Pacific, one base after another, each one closer to Japan itself. And in that moment, in the warm rain outside and the lamplight inside, the officers understand what the admirals truly fear. Not a single battle, not a single defeat. They fear losing the ability to choose where the war will be fought. They fear becoming passengers on the ocean instead of masters of it. March 5th, 1943. Rabaul, New Britain. The air over Simpson Harbor tastes of coal smoke and wet coral. Cloud hangs low enough to brush the ridgelines, and the jungle beyond the base looks black, soaked, and endless. Here, the perimeter is not a theory. It is a daily chore. A ship must arrive. A ship must unload. A ship must depart before American bombers find it. In a cramped bunker near the airfield, naval officers and army staff lean over a table lit by a single bulb. Maps of the Bismarck Sea and the Solomon Chain are smudged with fingerprints. A pilot, still wearing a flight suit damp with sweat, points at the sea lane north of New Guinea. His hands tremble slightly. Not from fear, but from exhaustion. The convoy routes are predictable. They have to be. Supply lines cannot improvise. Rice, ammunition, aviation gasoline, spare parts, medical supplies. Each item has weight, and weight demands cargo space. Cargo space demands ships. Ships demand escorts. Escorts demand fuel. Fuel demands tankers. Tankers demand protection. Everything becomes a chain, and the Americans have started cutting links. Japanese admirals had wanted the perimeter to be a wall. In reality, it is a web of shipping. Without shipping, the bases become isolated rocks with hungry garrisons. Outside the bunker, you can hear engines warming up. Mitsubishi A6M-Zeros line the dispersal area, canopies beaded with rain. A mechanic wipes a gauge with a rag and shouts to another man over the sound of propellers. The pilots climb in and strap down, faces pale in the grey morning. Many of the older aces are gone now. Some died at Midway. Some burned at Guadalcanal. Some vanished into the sea after a single burst of machine gun fire. Their replacements sit here now, trained enough to fly, not trained enough to dominate. A senior air officer, his collar tabs stained with sweat, speaks in clipped phrases. The Americans are flying more often. They are coordinating better. They hit runways, fuel dumps, and anchorages with a rhythm that feels unnatural, like the ocean itself is keeping time for them. When the raid siren wails, the base reacts with reflex. Men sprint for guns. Searchlights swing uselessly in daylight. Trucks disperse. Pilots race to cockpits. It is always the same dance. And it is always too late by a few minutes. You can feel the fear of being pinned. Rabaul is the fortress in the southern arc, a hub meant to dominate the Solomons and shield the approaches to the inner perimeter. It is strong, crowded with anti-aircraft guns, caves, and airfields. But strength is irrelevant if the enemy can ignore it and strike elsewhere. That is the new American style. They do not always smash the biggest fortress first. They leap around it, take the next island, build an airfield, and tighten the noose. A destroyer captain arrives, still smelling of diesel and sea spray. He has just escorted transport ships through dangerous water, and his voice carries the bitterness of a man who has watched the same nightmare too many times. He describes American aircraft appearing like hawks, high and gleaming, diving through cloud gaps to release bombs that walk across a deck. He describes the helplessness of a ship that cannot maneuver with a full cargo hold, its speed limited, its anti-aircraft guns firing until barrels glow. Then he mentions the Bismarck Sea, and the room goes quieter. March 2nd to March 4th, 1943. A convoy of transports and destroyers heading from Rabaul toward Leh has been mauled. Allied aircraft came in waves, not just level bombers, but low-flying attackers that skipped bombs across the water like stones. Bombs that slammed into hulls at the waterline. Ships erupted in fire. Men leapt into the sea. The escorts fought and fought, but the sky belonged to the enemy. For the Japanese, this is more than a tactical loss. It is a message written in burning oil. If convoys cannot move, then reinforcements cannot reach New Guinea. If reinforcements cannot reach New Guinea, then the army's defense lines crumble. If New Guinea crumbles, then the southern approach is open. And if the southern approach is open, the perimeter is no longer a ring. It is a series of isolated points waiting to be strangled. In the bunker, an army officer clenches his jaw. The Army and Navy do not always speak the same language, but they understand this together. The perimeter is collapsing, and the collapse is not dramatic. It is logistical. It is the slow failure of tonnage and fuel and pilot training hours. Admirals fear this kind of collapse because it cannot be fixed by bravery. You cannot shout at a ship to carry more cargo. You cannot order a pilot to conjure more flight hours. You cannot command an oil tanker to appear out of the sea. As evening falls, Rabaul's harbor is a dark mirror broken by the faint glow of cigarettes on decks. Anti-aircraft crews sit beside their guns and listen to the distant rumble of thunder, wondering if it is weather or engines. In the jungle, insects scream. In the bunkers, officers draw lines on maps and erase them and draw them again, trying to find a perimeter that makes sense. But every new line is closer to Japan, and in that tightening geometry lies the core dread of the Imperial Navy. They built their strategy on an ocean they believed they could shape. Now the ocean is shaping them. forcing them into corridors, forcing them into predictable routes, forcing them to gamble the few ships they have left just to keep distant bases alive. When you lose freedom of movement at sea, you lose the war's tempo. And when you lose the tempo, you lose the initiative. The enemy stops reacting to you. You begin reacting to the enemy. Rabaul's officers step outside into the damp night and look up. Clouds slide past the moon like a curtain. Somewhere beyond them, carriers move without lights. Somewhere beyond them, submarines wait in the shipping lanes. Somewhere beyond them, factories pour steel into hulls faster than Japan can count. The perimeter was supposed to be a shield. Now it is a burden carried on ships that are running out. June 30th, 1943, off Wendover Island, Central Solomons. The sea is oily and quiet, a deceptive calm under a sky smeared with low cloud. In the distance, thunder is not thunder at all. It is naval gunfire, deep and measured, rolling across the water like a heartbeat. American landing craft churn toward shore in long, disciplined lines, their wakes pale in the dim light. Marines crouch low, helmets strapped, hands tight on rifles. You can almost smell the cordite from the shells being fired overhead. For Japanese officers watching from observation posts hidden in jungle, the sound is the beginning of a nightmare they cannot stop. This is not another Guadalcanal, not the same kind of desperate contest for a single airfield. This is something colder and more methodical. The Americans have learned to step around the strongest points. They do not need to seize every island. They do not need to batter every fortress until it breaks. They pick a place that is weak enough to take, close enough to support, and useful enough to build on. Then they build. They bring engineers, bulldozers, fuel drums, and steel matting. In days, a strip becomes a runway. In weeks, a runway becomes a base. And every base becomes a knife edge that cuts deeper into the Japanese line. In a dugout on Kolombangara, a Japanese naval officer listens to a field telephone crackle. The voice on the other end reports American landings at Wendover and movement toward New Georgia. The officer rubs his forehead, leaving a smear of sweat and dirt. He knows what comes next. American aircraft will begin appearing in greater numbers. Their bombers will have shorter flights. Their fighters will be able to stay longer. The sea lanes between the islands will become more dangerous, and the Japanese will be forced again into night runs, again into high-risk deliveries, again into a war fought at the edges of exhaustion. A commander nearby unfolds a chart and points at Munda Airfield on New Georgia, a key Japanese strip that supports the whole region. Munda is the kind of place the perimeter relies on. It is a hinge. Lose it, and the door swings open. Hold it, and maybe you buy time. Time, always time. But time now has an American face. On the water, Japanese barges creep along coastlines at night, low silhouettes that hope to be mistaken for driftwood. They carry soldiers, boxes of ammunition, sacks of rice. The men inside sit hunched, rifles between their knees, whispering prayers into the darkness. They can hear aircraft engines in the distance, and every engine note makes their spines tighten. By day, American aircraft prowl like predators. They strike barges, patrol boats, destroyers, anything that moves. The Japanese learn to hide under jungle canopy, to move only when cloud cover is thick, to scatter supplies in small caches because big dumps invite bombs. It is improvisation, and improvisation is the language of a side losing control. In Tokyo and at fleet headquarters, admirals study reports and see a pattern forming like a tide chart. The Americans are using their strength in logistics to create options. Options mean unpredictability. Unpredictability means the Japanese perimeter, built on assumptions of where the enemy must go, begins to fail. A perimeter works when you can anticipate the attacker. When you know the attacker must come through certain gateways, you can concentrate forces, spring ambushes, and trade space for time. But if the attacker can choose different gateways or create new ones with airfields and ports, the defender must spread thin enough, and even strong points become isolated. This is what Japanese admirals fear most. Not just losing islands, but losing the ability to make the enemy fight on Japanese terms. In the Solomons, the terms are shifting hour by hour. American radar-equipped ships patrol at night. Their task forces coordinate with aircraft in ways that feel uncanny to Japanese commanders used to fighting by eyesight and intuition. A Japanese destroyer captain, veteran of earlier night battles, peers into darkness and feels exposed. He cannot see the American ships, but he knows they might already be tracking him. He knows they may already have his speed and bearing, already preparing gunfire. When the battle comes, it is often sudden. Searchlights flicker on, shells crash into the water, and steel screams as fragments tear into superstructures. Torpedoes run, leaving white trails that glow in the dark. Men shout orders over the roar of engines, and then, just as suddenly, it is over, with one ship listing and burning, another limping away, trailing oil, and the survivors clinging to rafts as the sea swallows their friends. Each loss is more than a ship. It is a night run not made. It is rice not delivered. It is ammunition that never reaches a hillside bunker. It is a pilot who will not be flown out to safety. It is a base that will become weaker, then fall. In the jungle on New Georgia, Japanese soldiers dig deeper. They build log and earth bunkers that can withstand shell fire. They lay mines. They set up machine guns with overlapping fields of fire. They fight with a grim determination that is personal, because the jungle gives no mercy and no easy retreat. But even as they fight, they can sense the larger movement. The Americans are not trying to kill every Japanese soldier in the Solomons right now. They are trying to build a ladder of airfields and harbors, stepping stones across the sea. Every stepping stone shrinks the Pacific. For Japanese admirals, the Pacific must remain wide. That width is Japan's armor. Distance is what makes American power slow, what makes American supply lines stretched, what makes every invasion costly. When the Americans build closer and closer, the ocean stops being a barrier. It becomes a highway. By late July 1943, as the struggle for Munda turns into a brutal grind of mud, malaria, and artillery, Japanese officers receive more bad news. American forces are probing elsewhere. The enemy is not focused on a single place. They are pressing multiple points, testing, feeling for weakness. The perimeter, once a confident arc, now looks like a net with holes, pulled tight by an opponent who understands how to tear it without punching through the center. On a humid evening, a Japanese commander stands near the edge of an airstrip and watches Zeros take off one by one, their engines rising into the sky like strained prayers. He knows some will not return. He knows the pilots who do return will come back shaken, counting the enemy fighters that seemed endless. He thinks of the admirals far away, staring at maps, drawing lines. And he realizes the fear they carry is not abstract. It is this: the enemy is taking away choices, taking away distance, taking away the idea that any island can be held indefinitely. Once you lose control of where the battle happens, you are no longer defending a perimeter. You are defending your way back to home. October 5th, 1943. Combined Fleet Headquarters, Tokyo. The air inside the conference room is dry compared to the tropics, but it feels heavier. The curtains are drawn. A ceiling fan stirs cigarette smoke into lazy spirals. On the wall, the Pacific map has been updated again, and again the line has moved. Admirals sit in rigid rows, hands on knees, faces set. This is not the kind of meeting where men raise their voices. The restraint is part of the culture, but it also hides something raw underneath. The war has reached the stage where everyone knows what is happening. Yet no one wants to be the first to say it plainly. A staff officer points to the outer ring. The territories seized between December 1941 and mid-1942. They were meant to be a shield. They have become a graveyard of promises. Wake held and then became irrelevant. The Gilberts and Marshalls are threatened. The Solomons are bleeding. New Guinea is consuming men and ships like a swamp that never fills. Rabaul is still there, still armed, still dangerous. But the Americans are finding ways to reduce it without storming it. They bomb it, isolate it, and move on. This is the new danger bypass. Bypassing is the enemy's way of turning Japanese strength into useless weight. A fortress cannot influence a battle that happens somewhere else. A garrison cannot stop an invasion it cannot reach. An airfield cannot protect shipping lanes if the shipping lanes no longer run near it. If the Americans can choose their targets, they can leave thousands of Japanese troops stranded on islands that slowly starve. The admirals talk about tonnage again. They talk about the convoy losses. They talk about how many destroyers have been used as transport ships. Their torpedo tubes removed to make room for drums of fuel and sacks of rice. They talk about how often those destroyers return riddled with shrapnel. Their crews reduced, their engines worn. But the heart of the meeting is a new line drawn on the map. It is closer to Japan. It is a line that includes the Marianas, the Carolines, the Palau Islands. It is the inner defense zone, the new perimeter that must hold, because if it does not, the war becomes something Japan has never truly faced. Direct threat to the home islands. A senior admiral, his face lined and stern, leans forward and taps the Marianas. Saipan, Tinian, Guam. Names that look harmless on paper, but every man in the room understands the implications. Those islands are not just bases, they are distance markers. From there, long-range bombers could reach Japan. Factories, cities, shipyards, the war economy itself. The room grows colder, despite the fan and the cigarettes. This is why Japanese admirals fear losing control of the Pacific. Because control is not a matter of pride. It is the difference between fighting far away and fighting with your own heart exposed. Another officer mentions the American shipbuilding pace in careful language, as if blunt truth might crack the walls. The United States is producing new carriers, new destroyers, new transports. Even when Japan wins a tactical engagement, the strategic balance continues to tilt. Japan cannot replace losses at the same rate. Japan cannot train pilots fast enough to match the attrition. Japan cannot fuel the fleet freely anymore. Fuel becomes the silent tyrant of every plan. In the early war, the Navy had dreamed of decisive battle, a single clash where Japan's well-trained forces would smash the American fleet. But decisive battle requires the fleet to be present, concentrated, and ready. It requires sorties, training, and long deployments. Every one of those demands fuel, and fuel now is guarded like gold. A lieutenant brings in a folder with charts showing consumption rates. Every time the fleet sorties, the stockpiles shrink. Every time tankers are sunk, the future shrinks. Every time shipping is disrupted, the pilot training program suffers. Because aircraft cannot fly without gasoline. Even the airfields cannot function without drums of fuel delivered by sea. The perimeter was supposed to be a network of bases. In reality, it is a network of fuel and shipping. An admiral speaks quietly about the psychological shift. In 1942, commanders believed they were shaping the war. In 1943, they feel they are chasing it. By the time they redeploy a force to meet one threat, the Americans strike somewhere else. By the time reinforcements arrive, the enemy has already built an airfield. By the time Japan fortifies an island, the enemy bypasses it and cuts the sea lane behind it. The Americans have turned the Pacific into a series of problems Japan must solve with fewer and fewer tools. In a corner of the room, a younger officer stares at the map and imagines the distance from Saipan to Tokyo. He imagines bombers droning over the home islands, sirens wailing, factories burning. He imagines civilians who have never heard enemy aircraft hearing them for the first time. He looks away quickly, as if the thought is shameful. But the older admirals have already looked at that thought until it became familiar. They discuss new plans, reinforce the inner line, concentrate air power, husband the fleet, prepare for the decisive battle when the Americans come into range. The words are formal, and the logic is traditional, but beneath it is desperation, because every plan now is built on the assumption that the Americans will eventually have to come close, that Japan can still choose a place to strike. But the Americans keep proving they can choose too. As the meeting ends, men stand and bow, the scrape of chairs loud in the quiet room. They file out with the same disciplined posture, the same controlled faces. Yet in the hallways, in the pauses between steps, you can sense what is eating at them. They are not only afraid of losing islands, they are afraid of losing the ocean. Because the ocean is the space that keeps the enemy far away. And once the enemy is no longer far away, the Imperial Navy's whole strategy becomes a shrinking room with no doors. Outside, Tokyo's streets carry on in their own rhythm. But inside the Navy's mind, the Pacific is contracting, and the admirals can feel the walls moving inward with every American landing and every convoy sunk. The inner line is being drawn, and everyone understands, without needing to say it, that an inner line is what you draw when the outer line has already failed. April 7th, 1944, Western Pacific, east of the Philippines. Dawn spreads like thin milk over the sea, turning the swells a dull silver. On the bridge of a Japanese cruiser, an officer lifts binoculars and scans a horizon that looks empty. Too empty. The wind carries the faint stink of fuel, and the ship vibrates with the steady labor of turbines. Every man aboard knows the rule now if the sky's quiet. It is only because the enemy is choosing when to make it loud. This is what losing control feels like at sea. It is not always a dramatic moment. Sometimes it is a long stretch of waiting, a knot in the stomach, a sense that the war is being conducted by someone else's timetable. The radio room crackles with reports. American carrier task forces have been sighted in one sector, then vanish. Submarine contacts in another sector. Air raids reported on distant bases. The information arrives in fragments, each one demanding a response, each one pulling at the fleet like a set of invisible ropes. The Japanese commander, jaw clenched, understands the trap. If he sorties the fleet to meet one threat, he risks sailing into another. If he holds back, he concedes initiative. Either choice is surrendering something. That is what admirals had feared since Midway and Guadalcanal, the day when every option is bad. Across the ship, men move with discipline. Gun crews check mounts and wipe down optics. Lookouts squint into the glare. The ship's doctor inventories bandages and morphine with the calm of someone who has done it too many times. There is a tightness to everything, a feeling of stored violence. But the violence they are preparing to unleash is being rationed now, not by their will, but by fuel and pilot quality and the enemy's reach. In the months since the inner line was drawn, the Pacific has been changing in a way that no amount of courage can stop. American bases multiply like stepping stones. Each new airfield is an extension of American eyes. American fighters. American bombers. Each new anchorage is a place where supplies can pile up and ships can refuel in safety. The United States has turned logistics into a weapon, and it is a weapon Japan cannot parry. Japanese admirals had once believed that the ocean's vastness would slow any opponent. Now the vastness is being measured and conquered, not by conquest alone, but by construction, runways, fuel farms, repair docks, radar stations. The sea lanes themselves are becoming American. And in the middle of that transformation sits Japan's greatest fear: isolation. When you lose control of the Pacific, you do not just lose battles. You lose the ability to connect your empire. You lose the ability to move oil from the south to the factories at home. You lose the ability to reinforce garrisons before they are attacked. You lose the ability to evacuate wounded or rotate exhausted units. You lose the ability to train pilots properly because flying hours require fuel that must arrive by ship. The war becomes a series of starving outposts and desperate sorties. On the bridge, the officer lowers his binoculars and glances at the chart table. Lines drawn in pencil show intended routes, rendezvous points, patrol boxes. But the pencil lines are fragile. The sea does not respect them. Neither does the enemy. A shout from a lookout snaps attention skyward. Far off, tiny specks glitter in the sun. At first they could be anything. Birds, reflections. Then the shape resolves. Aircraft. Many aircraft. You can feel the change in the ship's posture, a kind of collective inhalation. Officers bark orders, alarm bells clang, men run to stations, hatches slam. The air fills with the metallic smell of adrenaline and grease. The aircraft are not Japanese. They come in disciplined formations, diving and leveling in waves. Their engines are a roar that seems to shake the sky itself. The first bombs fall and the sea erupts in columns of white water. The ship's anti-aircraft guns begin firing. The sound like ripping cloth amplified into thunder. Shell casings clatter on a deck. Barrels heat. Gunners squint through smoke and recoil, tracking targets that keep coming. The officer on the bridge watches the horizon and realizes that this is the nightmare made routine. There is no duel here between equals. There is no clean exchange of blows. There is an air armada that can strike, withdraw, and strike again, because it has depth behind it. Reserves, replacements, fuel, and carriers that can rotate aircraft like a machine. A torpedo plane skims low, almost touching the waves. Another dives from above. The ship turns hard, bow cutting a white scar through the sea. The deck tilts. Men brace. A torpedo track flashes past, close enough that you can see the bubble trail. Then another. One hits a ship nearby, and the explosion thumps through the air like a giant fist. Smoke blooms. A secondary blast follows, sharper as ammunition cooks off. The Japanese ship survives the first wave, but surviving is not the same as controlling. The enemy can keep coming until the defender is exhausted. The defender must guess the next angle of attack. The enemy already knows where to return because radar and air scouting have turned the ocean into a grid. This is the ultimate reason Japanese admirals feared losing control of the Pacific. Control meant shaping the battlefield, choosing when and where to commit the fleet, forcing the enemy into a decisive clash under conditions Japan preferred. Without control, the fleet becomes reactive, dragged from crisis to crisis, committed piecemeal, worn down by air power and submarines before it can ever gather strength for a decisive moment. The fight in the sky fades as the planes pull away. The sea is littered with smoke and debris. On deck, men cough and wipe soot from their faces. A wounded sailor is carried past, eyes open and staring at nothing. The ship's engines continue to thrum, but now there is a damaged rhythm in it, a vibration that suggests strain. In the radio room, new messages arrive. Another base bombed, another convoy attacked, another outpost reporting shortages. The commander looks at the paper and feels something hollow. The perimeter is no longer a line to be held. It is a list of places that will be lost in some order the enemy will decide. The sun climbs higher. The sea looks calm again, indifferent. But the calm is deceptive because the war has already shifted. The Pacific has stopped being a shield for Japan and become a corridor for the United States. And that is the fear. Finally spoken, not in words, but in reality. Once control of the Pacific slips away, everything else follows. The outer perimeter collapses. The inner line tightens. The home islands come into range. And the Imperial Navy, built to win by decisive battle and audacity, finds itself fighting a war of endurance it cannot sustain. In the end, the admirals were not simply afraid of losing territory. They were afraid of losing the ocean's distance, the war's tempo, the nation's ability to breathe. And when those were gone, the Pacific did what it always does. It swallowed the losing side in silence.